People on the road to victory, all through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad, and then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has seen, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
전체의 사회 주기를 우리 어떻게 정대로 지키는가를 세계여보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 영군님 백승의 영도 따라서 선군의 붉은 기 그 신념으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 조체의 강성대국을 우리 어떻게 이 땅에 세우는가를 세계여보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 정군님의 뜻을 받들어 붉은 정신력 그 배짱으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다.
Sin
조선 결심하면 한다. 조선 한다면 한다. Yagad negna 얇긴 태rek지 얇긴 나라게 대복시마 어던지니 헌칠셈 어거지민 헌칠셈 내 때문이 소스테홍 내리지 바다를 올려줘
Le Vietnam brûle et moi je hurle Mao Mao. Johnson rigole et moi je vole Mao Mao. Le napalm coule et moi je roule Mao Mao. Les villes crèvent et moi je rêve Mao Mao. Les putains crient et moi je ris Mao Mao. Le riz est fou et L'impérialisme dicte partout sa loi. La révolution n'est pas un dîner. La bomba est un tigre en papier. Les masses sont les véritables héros. Les ricains tuent et moi je mue Mao Mao. Les fous sont rois et moi je bois Mao Mao. Les bombes tonnent et moi je sonne Mao Mao. Les bébés fuient et moi je fuis Mao Mao. Les Russes mangent et moi je danse Mao Mao. Diable dénonce, je renonce Mao Mao.
C'est le petit livre rouge qui fait que tout enfin bouge.
La base de l'armée, c'est le soldat. Le vrai pouvoir est au bout du fusil. Les monstres seront tous anéantis. L'ennemi ne périt pas de lui-même. Mao Mao. Mao Mao. Mao Mao. Mao Mao.
When I was young, I used to be as fine a man as ever you'd see in the Prince of Wales. He said to me, come and join the British Army. Tooraloo, they're looking for monkeys up in the zoo. It says, one, if I had a face like you, I joined the British Army. Sarah Connon baked a cake, and so for poor old Slattery sake, sure I threw myself into the lake, pretending I was barmy. Tooraloo, I've made me mind up what to do. Now I'll work me ticket home to you and the British Army. Sergeant Healy went away and his wife got in the family way, and the only words that she could say was blame the British Army. Tooraloo, me curse upon the Labour Blue that took me darling boy from me to join the British Army. Corporal Sheen is a terrible note, just give him a couple of jars of stout and he bait the enemy with his mouth and save the British Army. Tooraloo, I've made me mind up what to do. Now I'll work me ticket home to you and the British Army.
Hello, everybody, and welcome along. It is the late afternoon in Perfidious Albion, and it is around about 20 to 5. I'm starting a little early because, of course, this is a matter of some importance, and therefore I thought it would be best to get in here and start the program. So you will have all seen it. I imagine that's why there's nearly 400 of you waiting for this. And we are live, of course, on YouTube, Instagram, X, or Twitter if you prefer, and also Rumble and Facebook. So you can find us on multiple platforms. So what we are here today to discuss, of course, is the collapse of the Syrian government over the last 48 hours or so. And what happened, why it happened, and what is the broader lessons to be drawn out from this. Now, let's start with what happened, and be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. Now, you'll be aware that a couple of weeks ago, in fact, less than that, the first attacks by the various rebranded Al-Qaeda formations, led by a guy who used to work for Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So there you go. Shows you who he is, this guy Al-Julani. began their attack on Aleppo in northern Syria. Now, according to sources that Russian sources that have been quoted in various different places, initially the Turkish and ultimately US-backed faction here didn't expect to make that much progress. They had a rather limited set of objectives in mind. But what happened was that there was a wholesale and rapid collapse of large sections of the Syrian Arab army, and this continued. The army kept withdrawing. Various units kept surrendering or just running away en masse, and this continued and continued and continued until we get, of course, the departure of Assad in the last 24 hours. And so what happened was a engineered collapse, really, of the Syrian Arab army. And so there's no doubt as to this. There's many different accounts as to what happened in Aleppo and then further down the road from there. It's clear that many commanders ordered their troops not to fight. There was apparently a breakdown in army discipline, with some units and some commanders trying to fight, others fleeing, others ordering their soldiers not to fight. So when the Syrian government tried to send reinforcements to Aleppo, Syrian army commanders were countermanding those orders and telling troops not to advance. So it's clear that there was a complete breakdown in the authority of the Syrian government over its own forces. Now, this is a subject which we will learn more about in the coming days as to what happened here, but or why it happened. But initially, we do have some information as to why it happened. Now, according to, again, these are Russian sources being quoted, so take this with a slight pinch of salt if you want. You could say that the Russians are trying to dispose of blame for this, what is undoubtedly a debacle, but some of this does seem believable. Now, Russian sources claim that the Syrian government, and I will refer to the Syrian government throughout this because I think it is always ridiculous to boil down an entire system of government into the personage of one individual, be it Assad, Putin, or even an American president. No system is just ruled by one man. It's ridiculous to claim that. So the Syrian government, according to these Russian military sources, started essentially to dismantle the army that had won its victories, or dismantle the command structure in 2018. The Russians claimed that the Syrian government started getting rid of the successful military commanders who had overseen the reconquest of places like Aleppo in 2018. That raises the question as to why that happened, but I don't have information as to the exact reasoning there. Also, the other reports coming out of Syria and elsewhere include the allegation made by Russian sources and Iranian sources that the Syrian government was being increasingly influenced by our old friends, the Gulf Comprador states. Now, you'll recall that in the last, across the course of the last year, there was an apparent reconciliation between the Assad-led government, the Syrian government, and the Gulf states and the Saudis. And the Syrian government welcomed back into the Arab League and with all kinds of pomp and circumstance. Now, this at the time was seen as some sort of great victory of amazing Russian, Chinese diplomacy. Well, in reality, I think it is clear that what happened here was that there was a change in tactics by the imperialists and by the Gulf Comprador regimes. The Gulf states, having failed to militarily destroy the Syrian government in the period 2011 to 2016, changed tactics. And what they did was they held out the promise of sanctions relief and other benefits alongside that, and used that, I think, to gain an increasing amount of influence over the inner workings of the Syrian government. And it should be emphasized as well that the state of Syria, the bits of Syria that were under government rule, was not good and had been in very dire straits for quite some time. The sanctions, of course, imposed on Syria by US imperialism and its allies were deliberately imposed to cripple the Syrian economy. That's certainly true. And there was apparently limited progress made in terms of rebuilding. So, and of course, there was an earthquake in Syria in 2023, I think, that also adversely affected the population. So you have a state which is being increasingly swayed by the promises of the Gulf states, who essentially, for all the periodic rows they have with US imperialism, are still agents of US imperialism. You have them holding out the promise of sanctions relief and potential reconstruction to people in the Syrian ruling circles, which of course include certain elements of the Syrian capitalist class. And I think it is the combination of these things that explain, all these factors that explain the sudden and total collapse, because the sudden and total collapse is a mark of a deliberate choice by very senior members of the Syrian government. Whether that implicates Assad or not, I don't know. It would certainly seem that Assad himself probably made some poor decisions as to who to trust, but it seems that he's still alive and is somewhere outside of Syria. That this was probably part of the deal. It seems that he was probably presented with a fait accompli by senior people within the state system, influential people outside of the state system, but who have influence over the Syrian government. He was presented with a fait accompli. Your forces are no longer yours to command. The defeat will come soon. You'd better negotiate yourself a way out. So this is calculated collapse from within. That's why well, let's just call them what they are. The US proxy forces advanced so quickly. I see some people are saying, oh, Erdogan now rules Syria. No, the US is the primary influence within Syria. Yes, the US is allied to Erdogan and to the Gulf states and to the Saudis, but the US is the decisive factor in this. And let's not forget that. There's many people saying, oh, it was an Israeli plot, it was a Turkish plot, it's a Gulf state plot. Identify the master. Identify who's really there, who's really calling the shots here. And it's Washington, as it always was. Without them on board, this wouldn't happen. So there are, of course, other questions to be raised here, such as, well, why was it that the enclaves in northern Syria around Idlib were left free to build up a substantial military force, updated with the latest military equipment? Why was it that the US was left free to arm and train via the Turks, mainly in the north, this re-equipped rebel force? Why were they left alone to do that? Now, that's an interesting question. Why did the Russians and the Iranians, having put a lot on the table to defend Syria, to defend the Syrian government, and in the case of the Iranians going all the way back to 2011, why was it that they engaged in the so-called Astana process, which turned out to be, of course, a total fraud? And why did they leave these US-backed, and it's always, I will always name them for what they are, US-sponsored, this US-sponsored mercenary army, which is what it is, in northern Syria to do what it pleased for so long? Again, an interesting question, and one which so far I haven't seen any answers be forthcoming from Iranian or from Russian sources. It seems that the Iranians and the Russians are trying to pin this all on Assad himself and his failings, and undoubtedly there are severe failings on behalf of the former Syrian government. But it must also be the question must also be asked is exactly, well, what was the plan here? What did the Syrians and the Russians, the Iranians and the Russians plan to do when they'd pushed the US forces, US mercenary forces, back to Idlib? Why did they engage in this long-winded process? Also, why was it that the Syrian government dismantled its own winning army in terms of the hierarchy of it? All of these are questions which must be asked. We don't have the information on them as yet. But to refer back to the military affairs, the rapid attack by the U.S. mercenary forces was successful, not because of these people are military geniuses, but simply because, for the most part, they didn't have to do that much fighting. They attacked the Syrian army, fell into disorganization. Large elements of it capitulated. Some elements fought, but not enough. And it became clear that the Syrian state itself was fundamentally compromised from within. And so this, as is always the case when discussing things like, blitzkrieg attacks, which of course the NATO planners are enamored with and have tried to use over and over again in Ukraine, these work best when you don't have to fight very much at all, or when there's a severe internal collapse of the system. This is the case with what happened here in Syria. They just simply were pushing at an open door, and the Russian sources, again, take it with a health warning, were saying that the Syrian government was warned. That the Iranians say that they warned them, but the Iranian sources are now saying that the Iranian government was offering to assist the Syrian government, but the Syrian government basically stopped communicating with them, which again tells me that this is a case of essentially a lot of people inside the Syrian government flipping over to the side of ultimately the imperialists, selling the country to US imperialism and its allies. That is what has happened. And let's get to the blunt truth here, which is the whole question here the whole problem here comes down to not only, of course, the machinations of the US imperialists. Their cruelty and savagery is well known, but also it comes down to failures on the anti-imperialist side. Failures of, for instance, Baathism. Baathism has now completely failed in Syria, as it completely failed in Iraq. You can say quite rightly that it was the imperialist interventions and siege of the country of Iraq and then of Syria, and the deliberate siege warfare to demoralize and destroy the will of the population to fight. But it also points to a severe failure of Baathism itself, which is that in both cases, in Iraq and Syria, the Baathist movement was a movement that came from or out of certain sections of the military in many cases. And this, whilst it did achieve certain progressive things in both countries, it was also something which was not a revolutionary movement of the masses. It wasn't. It remained a movement of inspired by like the old Nasserite free officer kind of formations. These are much more vulnerable to disruption by imperialism than it's something like a communist government or a workers and peasants government, which is of course something based on the continued mass mobilization of the workers and peasants, such as a government like the DPRKs. The reason why, of course, they haven't been successful in their bids, multiple bids to overturn the system in the DPRKs, because it's a system based on the constant mass politicization and mobilization of the masses to advance and to defend the revolution. That wasn't present in the case of Baathism. Baathism remained something that was, whilst it had progressive elements, was still essentially ruled by a minority. And it failed. It failed to overcome the religious and sort of ethnic differences in Syria. Now, those differences, whilst they were deliberately placed there and then deliberately ratcheted up by the actions of imperialism, these differences are not impossible to overcome. Various communist parties have in the past overcome religious and ethnic differences. And this could have been done in Syria, but the Baathists never achieved it. Yes, imperialism was always playing its games, always trying to undermine things, especially in the last 10 to 15 years. But they were able to exploit these weaknesses because they remained unaddressed. Like they're able to exploit the Kurdish national question because it wasn't satisfactorily addressed within that Syrian state. So of course the Kurdish leadership willingly then sold themselves to imperialism. I think they will still live to regret doing so, but the imperialists can't exploit contradictions that aren't there. They are very good at identifying dividing lines. They're very good at opening them up where they can. But again, Baathism had been there since the early 1970s at the very least, in the form of the rule of Hafez al-Assad, and failed to address the weaknesses that were within the Syrian state. And ultimately, these were exploited by imperialism, as imperialism is always going to do. So Baathism is a failure. It has, again, achieved certain things, but ended in disgrace and treachery, which is what has gone on here. It is clear that this fall of Syria came about through internal treachery. And this should be a very significant lesson for us. And here I will give an example from the past. I mentioned previously that the old Nazi tactic of blitzkrieg was based partly upon basically getting your opponent to quit early. And this happened for them in France, especially, where, again, there was an internal coup inside the French state, a pro-fascist coup, and they capitulated to the Nazis quite deliberately in order that they could focus on the real enemy as they saw it, which was the communists. So that's one example of how the fabled Nazi blitzkrieg was dependent, really, when it came to France, on internal treachery doing a lot of the work for them. They expected the same in Russia. This is why Hitler had read too much Trotsky as well, and unfortunately for him, believed a lot of it. But they expected, when they launched the blitzkrieg on Russia, and they launched Barbarossa, they thought that they would be able to knock the Soviet Union over because they expected to have more fifth column traitors inside the USSR than they did. Ultimately, the Soviet Union under Stalin, in the Stalin period, had successfully snuffed out most of the fifth columnists and the traitors in the military and the party and the state organizations in the purges of the 1930s. That's what this was all about. The Stalin and the other Soviet leaders knew very well that there were those in the military and those in the hierarchy of the state and the party who would have been prepared to do what we've just seen in Syria on a much, much bigger scale to the Soviet Union in 1941. And that's what the purges of the 1930s were all about, finding these potential and real fifth columnists and putting them on trial, and in many cases executing them. Because if they hadn't rumbled the Tukhachevsky plot, if they hadn't found the Trotskyite underground, which we know from Trotsky's own archive existed, then when the attack came from the imperialist forces, be it the Hitlerites or somebody else, then the fifth column would have been activated, and you would have seen what Hitler was expecting, which is, as he said, kick the door in and the whole rotten fortress comes tumbling down. And that should remind us again that the actions of the Soviet government in the 1930s were not only completely justified, but they were necessary for the defense of the revolution, for the defense of the country. If they hadn't done it, then the Soviet Union would not have lasted, would not have survived the attack from the Nazis, because there was too many fifth columnists within who would have been activated when the invasion started, and you would have seen a collapse, or if not a collapse, then a much more damaging and perhaps even longer war due to the actions of various traitors. But the other part of this is, of course, that the workers and the peasants of the Soviet Union, because they recognized the state as their state and they were directly involved in the management of it, they knew very well that they were fighting to preserve a revolution and a state that was theirs, and hence they were willing to make enormous sacrifices in defending it. And to go back to blitzkrieg tactics, the adoption of these by the US and its proxies, of course, should teach us a lot, because they've been trying to do the same kind of attacks as they just did in Syria in Ukraine. In fact, this is what the Kursk incursion was based around. It's what the disaster that the Ukrainians had inflicted on them in Krinky was about. It was about rapid attacks that were combined with massive information warfare that would then, they hoped, combined with sanctions, combined with internal treachery, destabilize the Russian state and cause a collapse. They hoped to achieve in Russia on a much, much bigger scale what has just been achieved in Syria, which was achieved only partially. In fact, quite the minority of the success came on the battlefield. The biggest success came in the hollowing out of the Syrian state and the active treachery of many within it. That's where the imperialists really won their victory. They were able to win on the battlefield because they'd already won the political battle inside the Syrian state itself. Fortunately, the Russian government has been aware of this and has been taking measures, it would seem, to isolate and disempower fifth columnists inside their own country. They are still present there, though. The Chinese are aware of it as well. The Chinese are acutely aware, it would seem, of the dangers posed by this fifth column type activity, which is why you've had this ongoing, basically ongoing purges within the Chinese party and state system, really going for a decade now, and they are ongoing. And the reason why they had to do it was exactly the reasons we've just been talking about, because by the time the Xi Jinping leadership came to power, they were looking at a situation where they found that the imperialists had hundreds of agents and compromised individuals at their beck and call within the Chinese state, which is why the Chinese launched the anti-corruption campaign. It's why the imperialists went absolutely apeshit when they did, because they started rolling up the networks of spies and fifth columnists within China. So the Chinese and the Russians are aware of these problems, and this should concentrate their mind ever further on them, because imperialism will not stop its games. It's won this victory in Syria, and we'll come to what they will do with the victory in Syria in just a moment, but it's won this victory through treachery, fifth column type activity, and collapse brought about internally via the machinations carried out by the various different political actors and intelligence agents who were able to influence those within the hierarchy of the Syrian state. So, and again, like people, a lot of people in the multipolar media space who yesterday were telling you, US has fallen, Israel has fallen, we're victory assured, the way is open, will now tell you the US cannot be defeated. Imperialism is too powerful. Oh my God, kill yourselves now. Now, I posted about this earlier today, and I want to read what I said again, because it is it needs re-emphasizing. So I'm just going to read the statement I made earlier about like how we should regard this. So, point one, this does not mean, this victory, that the decline of US imperialism is reversed. It has just revealed that it still has the ability to cause a lot of damage, but the decline is very much permanent. Bear in mind, the decline of US imperialism goes right the way back to the 1960s and its later defeats in Vietnam in the 1970s. It still doesn't deploy its own men to do the dirty work. This work in Syria was all done, well, most of it was done by mercenaries recruited and trained by the CIA, various different military contractors brought in by the Department of Defense, the Turks and the Turkish intelligence agencies, the Israelis to a degree. But again, this was a mercenary army doing the dirty work. The US still doesn't like to deploy its own men, still doesn't really like to deploy many of its own assets directly. Better to get somebody else to do it for you. Better to outsource the war. All of that points to the fact that they're still in this period of long decline. And also the fact is the decline isn't just about its unwillingness to use its own assets militarily speaking, but also because of the sheer level of financialization and rot within the American system. And that will continue. That continued even after the collapse and the counter-revolution in the Soviet Union. They continued to decline all the way through the 1990s. You got this burst of profitability in the 90s, but then again, it was all destroyed in the multiple crises that followed and led up to the great crash in 2008, which they still haven't got over, neither have the Western Europeans. So this will make them rather heady about their chances for a while, but it doesn't change the overall trajectory. Neither did the looting of Iraq or the looting of Libya change the trajectory either. So imperialism is still powerful. It still has the ability to inflict a lot of death and destruction and disaster. But let us look at this victory they have won in a more clear light. This was a victory won by treachery, backstabbing, and corruption in reality. And that shows us that there are, that again, it shows us the very, very, very real failures of Baathism, but also the poor calculations of a lot of the bourgeois forces who have come into some form of combat with imperialism. They're thinking that they can reach a deal. And as I've said before, about the Russians kept thinking they could reach a deal, but it is the very crisis of imperialism which makes deals impossible. The only thing imperialism needs is the complete collapse of all of its enemies, so it can loot them, and even that wouldn't really stop the decline. It would arrest it for a while, because what is happening is the rotting away and the hollowing out of the U.S. imperialist system internally means that even if they get to loot more areas, it just pours more money, good money after bad, into a rotten system. And the same would be true no matter how much looting they got to do. It would postpone the decline, but it would not stop it. It would not arrest it entirely. So does this mean that the multipolarity is over? Multipolarity is already in existence. What I have always spoken against is this fantasy that a lot of what are sort of disillusioned social democrats have, that somehow this multipolar world is going to be built, and then there's going to be somehow some people peddle the myth that Trump or somebody else is just going to accept the US playing a subordinate role, and there's going to be some new deals between Russia and China and the US to manage the world transition in a stable fashion. None of that is going to happen. The US ruling class cannot and will not accept anything less than total domination. It cannot afford to accept anything less than that. And so they will continue on this path, and they will continue to try to destroy their opponents. And the quicker everybody realizes that there's no bargaining with this rabid beast, because it is a case of it either destroys its opponents and gets to loot them, or it dies. There's no bargaining with that. Not really. So, but does it mean that multipolarity doesn't exist anymore? No, there's multiple poles of power in the world. The Chinese are a very significant challenge to U.S. economic domination. That doesn't reverse the problems that the U.S. imperialists face internally with regard to deindustrialization, with regard to the fact that they are locked in this rivalry with the Chinese, which they are losing on the economic front. They are still losing on the economic front, and it will mean that they will be compelled into more and more vicious and aggressive acts to try and destroy their opponents. So the Chinese have talked for a long time about how there's no reason to fight. We can each find our way into a world which can be mutually beneficial in terms of the relationship between the Chinese and the United States. But imperialism doesn't work like that. It won't let them have that. Imperialism will work consistently and rabidly for the destruction of China and Russia. It seems that at least a certain section, and a growing section, of the leadership in China and the wider party in China, and at least the leadership in Russia, are aware of this. The Chinese party, I think, certainly there are many people in that who understand this well. The problem I see with the Chinese is that they're still putting out this idea that there can be some sort of peaceful partnership restored with the US, and that at least internally, I hope that they are discussing within their organizations that not only is this not possible, but the reasons why it's not possible. I would hope, and again, I don't know that they are not doing this, I'm just not aware that they are, that if they are, that the Chinese party is very much making its up and coming cadres study Lenin's imperialism in a systematic and serious way. Because by reading that, you can understand why we are where we are, and why imperialism absolutely cannot stop. So, moving on to the next point I'm making, multipolarity is already a factor that in the world. The defeat in Syria won't change that. The growing power of the Chinese won't be reversed by that. It is a victory for imperialism that will not do much to arrest its decline, I don't think. Now, the point 3, that the US has still lost the war in Ukraine, but the lesson the Russians will have to draw from the bitter experience here is that no agreements signed with imperialism or its proxies are worth the paper they are written on. Certainly not agreements that leave enemy forces intact and able to be brought back into play later on. This means that basically the Trump plan for peace in Ukraine doesn't seem to me to be much of a goer. In fact, the overall strategy of the US imperialists up until now has been to try and spin out the war as much as possible. There will be those within the Trump camp who will try to force a disadvantageous peace on Russia and try to do in Ukraine what was done in Syria, which is essentially draw the conflict to a temporary halt and then use that time to rebuild Ukrainian forces. Now, the Russians will know that very well. So we will have to hope that those who have an understanding of this inside Russia will prevail, and nobody will fall for Trump's peace bullshit, because it is bullshit. Now, basically, he's saying that so far that the Ukrainian state gets to be preserved, and essentially they will then, even if it's no NATO for 20 years, they want to reserve the right to essentially rebuild it again and then go on the attack when they feel like they've got when they've got the right balance of forces in their favor. The imperialists' wars are always multifaceted. They can always change tactics, just as they have done with Syria. They ultimately, the military solution was nowhere near as important as the political one for them, and they found a political and economic solution in terms of essentially exploiting the treachery of certain characters within the Syrian state. They may change tactics against the Russians, but it would be more difficult to change tactics now. Again, the ball is in the Russians' court, though. They can fight this to a conclusion. They can settle things on the battlefield because, as I have said over and over again, the US and the Europeans do not dare to deploy their own men to get into a shooting war with the Russians. They won't dare to do it. And so the Russians can force a military outcome in Ukraine in a way that they were not prepared to do in Syria. As Putin said himself, and I think he was correct in this, we cannot be more Syrian than the Syrians themselves. And that's true. They couldn't. However, questions must still be asked about quite why they fought, leaving the enclave, the NATO enclave intact in Idlib was a good idea, and also why they thought that the negotiating with Erdogan was something worth doing. I've got my own theories on that. I think that the Russians thought that by negotiating with the Turkish regime, that they could somehow loosen the grip that the US has over it. The US has a very tight grip over the Turkish regime, has done for over 70 years, isn't going to give it up anytime soon. So, as I've said before, point 4 that I was making this morning, too many people who just 2 weeks ago were telling everyone that the US is dead will now say the US cannot be beaten. The reality is that the decline of US imperialism is a slow process, and its final defeat must be brought about inside the US itself by the US working class. No one else can finally put an end to the US ruling class other than the American worker. That's the bold truth of this, that the US ruling class will continue to rampage and make trouble all over the world, continue to push coups and continue to push so-called color revolutions, regime change wars. They will continue to employ the services of fascist gangs, whether these are Ukrainian fascists, Syrian fascists, Central Asian fascists, South American fascists. International fascism is in the service of the US imperialists, has been since World War II, arguably earlier, but certainly since World War II. And they'll always find people who are willing to serve them. There's no point denying that. And the final defeat of this can only be brought about, as I said, inside the US itself, which leads me to point 5. No one else is going to do the work of liberating us in the West from decaying imperialism. Not the Chinese, not the Russians, nor anybody else. Nor should we attempt to outsource our class struggle to anybody else. Too many people invest all their hopes in that somehow multipolarism will just win. It's like that old meme about, Xi Jinping does nothing, wins. That's not true, is it? Man cannot live on memes alone. And there are people who keep telling you, consciously or otherwise, that no struggle is required. The defeat of imperialism will require a long and arduous fight. And that the long and arduous fight, in terms of our engagement with it, is domestically. We must build our forces to fight the domestic class struggle in solidarity with our natural allies, the oppressed peoples of the world. That is what we must do. And that only comes through building or rebuilding communist parties in the imperial core nations, where the official communist parties are all rotten, for all the way across Europe, and as was the case with the old CPUSA in the United States, where the old left, the Western left, is all rotten, as you can see by so many of them celebrating the victory of US imperialism in Syria. And those people should not be allowed to forget that they have celebrated the victory of US imperialism, because, again, this shouldn't be a surprise. People are citing like the Labour left in Britain going on about how it's great that the dictator has fallen. Well, these people have supported imperialism relentlessly for over 100 years. This political tendency has. So why would they change now? And it's not, people say, oh, they're cheering on the head choppers in Syria. And what they're really doing is they're cheering on US imperialism. So what people like Owen Jones, Yanis Varoufakis, Paul Mason are doing is they're cheering on US imperialism, because they know that the system which they exist within, particularly like these parasite academics and these professional liars, is dependent upon the continued strength and the survival of US imperialism. It's where a lot of these like social democratic traitors ultimately know that the gravy train comes from. It comes from the strength of US imperialism. So they go and cheer it on wherever it engages. There's a slight difference over Palestine, but I've addressed that in other videos, which you can go back and watch. I won't be revisiting that today. So we don't get to outsource our struggles. A lot of people sit there on their computers looking at struggles waged by other countries and other peoples elsewhere and cheering that on, and not engaging in the struggle in their own country at all. They have become like passive media observers whose moods are fed by algorithms and go from a dizzying high to a dizzying low within about a week, because they're just constantly staring at the updates from the, let's be honest, professional con men in the so-called multipolar media space. And I've just about stopped listening to all of them, because all of them like hype the wrong thing, say that the victory is at hand, no, defeat is at hand, no, here comes despair. Stop listening to people like that. Stop listening to people like that who talk perpetual shit. Oh, US is finished. It's not finished. It's not finished. It's still there. Yes, it's been on the slide, but it's accumulated a hell of a lot of capital inside the United States. The US ruling class has a hell of a lot of money, and even though it operates under more restrictions these days, a hell of a lot of ability to make war, to cause mass death, to sabotage and destroy nations. They are a ruthless, merciless force still, who must be fought with equal tenacity. And anything less than that will only lead us to defeat. And it's not good enough, if you're in the West, to sit on your computer or sit on a look at your phone and scroll through like struggles in other areas and like retweet them and think that you're being part of the struggle. You're not. You're being a passive observer of mediated events. So join, if you're angry about all of this, these events that have happened over the last few days or few weeks, so if you're angry rightly about the criminality of US imperialism when it comes to occupied Palestine or wherever you're looking at, then the solution is right in front of you, which is join a communist party in your country, and if you're in an imperialist country, and start the process of building the class struggle inside this country, to build it to a point where the challenge to the ruling class domestically can be posed by the domestic working class. That's the only way out. There's no other way around this. Excuse me. There's no easy way out. There's no waiting for the Chinese to do nothing and win. And it's no good becoming a fanboy of various chosen foreign leaders. That's not what revolution is about. Again, we are facing a slow and painful process of rebuilding our forces from the ground upwards, and then we must put ourselves in a position where we can challenge the ruling class domestically, dismantle US imperialism by dismantling its occupation force in Europe. That can only come from the revival of class struggle across the European nations to demand the end of US occupation of Europe. Again, something only the mass struggles of the working class can achieve. So these are the challenges that are before us. It's no good banging away at the keyboard and weeping and wailing and rending your clothing. You can do all that in private. I won't be engaging in any of that because it's the job of a communist is to analyze and to promote understanding and to promote thinking, not knee-jerk responses and wailing and gnashing of teeth. All of that is for foolish and rather silly people, and we're not in the business of engaging in melodramatics. We shouldn't be anyway. So I will leave my comments there for now and turn to start some questions. Right. Okay, so going to start with the going to start at the bottom perhaps and work my way up. Right. Droney Donny says nothing is falling in terms of American imperialism. Things are just getting bad for us, for the working class, to which I say that's the goal. Yes, the class war against the American worker is intensifying. That's true. But I would say beware of overestimating the power of the US ruling class. Like if they had the power to, to bring Russia down, they would have done it by now. If they had the power to bring the Chinese down, they'd have done it by now. They are limited in what they can do. What they can do is still ferocious in terms of their ability to impose horrors upon the world. But yes, the essential part of your point is correct, which is the ruling class aren't suffering. They are waging a relentless class war upon the working class, and that's what must be emphasized. Caustic Grip says, let's not exclude the possibility that Syria might become a huge US forward base against Iran and Lebanon. Well, they've already got troops there. I mean, the future for the Syrian state is a grim one, given that you've got various different groups within those who are taking over who don't have the same agenda or have competing agendas, like in Libya. Like you've got the Kurdish groups who I'm just waiting for them to be betrayed by the US, who are in a conflict with the Erdogan regime, and the Turkish bourgeois have their influence inside Syria. You've also got the Gulf states and the people who are tied to them. You've got the US imperialists themselves and their Israeli proxy, which is the Israelis have already seized some land. It's the biggest victory the Israeli army has won in the last year was to advance into Syria and take a hill without firing a shot. That's the kind of victory that they prefer. But yeah, they may try and do that, or it may be that the situation becomes so unstable that they can't do much with it. I don't know at the moment, but there's an awful lot of competing agendas in Syria that, just as there was in Libya, and the US, again, pointing to their degeneracy, isn't particularly good at building stable states. They wanted, ideally, a stable proxy, a stable puppet state in Iraq. That was the point of their invasion. In the end, they didn't quite get that, and most of their forces were forced to leave because they were getting shot at too much. And the same is going to happen here. Like they aim for a stable puppet regime, but I don't think they'll get that. they have their moment of triumph, and now what will happen is they won't be able to do all that much with it. All they're capable of doing is creating chaos and disaster. That's all they did in Iraq. That's all they've done in Libya. That's all they will do here. What you'll end up with is various different factions fighting it out inside Syria, serving various different masters. Some serving the US itself, some more aligned with the Erdogan regime, some more aligned with the Gulf states. Then you've got the Kurds in the middle of it all as well. And there's already been clashes between the Turkish-backed forces and the Kurdish forces. So quite what the US imperialists are going to do about that, because that's the Turkish bourgeois and Erdogan's red line is the Kurdish state, which the SDF leaders have said they want to create. We'll see whether the US permits them to or not. I doubt they will, which will lead to problems in the SDF. So there's a whole mass of unresolved problems that are now coming to the forefront now that the Syrian government has collapsed. Irish Partisan says a similar event nearly happened in Belarus in 2020 when the US and certain elements within the Russian comprador class recruited a number of people within the Belarusian bourgeois. Yeah. Thankfully, though, the Belarusian government stood firm and managed that situation quite well. I would say, though, that the vulnerabilities to U.S. imperialist intervention via their recruiting people into like color revolution type organizations, the best defense against that is a politicized and mobilized working class, which exists to a degree in Belarus, and I think it probably exists more now in Russia than it did 2 years ago. But you've still got a lot of dangerous comprador elements in both countries, which needs to be eliminated, quite frankly. And until they are, then the US is always going to have ways of worming its influence in there. Okay. Just going through some comments here. Risto Kostadinov says the real problem is Turkey will continue fueling war and killing Kurds, and what will the Israelis do? The Israelis will seize as much land as they can get away with. I mean, a lot of this is going to be, the US is going to be locked in like a long bargaining session with the Turks, the Israelis, the Gulf states as to who gets influence where. I mean, Netanyahu is already claiming that the whole thing was his idea. It wasn't, but he needs a victory, so he's going to claim this one. So the Israelis will seize as much land as they can get away with, as much land as the US will let them have. The neo-Ottomanism crowd in Ankara will want their slice of the action, and they'll probably want to either run a puppet state or absorb Syrian territory directly. All of this is going to be much more difficult for these regimes than they think, though. And the Turks will continue the war until the SDF either capitulates or is defeated. That, again, that's for the Turkish bourgeois, that's a red line, and they will enforce that. Now, to answer TM's point, you said that the situation might become better for the Syrian people. The situation's been dire for the Syrian people for a long time. I doubt that whoever the US puts in place there will be particularly interested in improving it. Life for the elite will get easier. They will find that they can go to Europe, buy property and loot things out of Syria. But what you'll get out of Syria is a giant refugee crisis. There will probably be millions more will flee out of Syria. And of course, that suits the imperialists just fine. They can get more hyper-exploitable labor out of the refugee crisis. This is how they exploited the last great crisis 10 years ago, and they will exploit this one as well. Syria will end up drained of its population if this continues. For the imperialists, that again, that suits them just fine. No, the again, to answer Agricola's point, the the Saudis dance towards BRICS and then dance away from it again. The Brazilians are, again, Brazil has a serious problem with like a still powerful comprador bourgeoisie in Brazil. They have a real problem with that. So until that's addressed, the progress of these countries is going to be held back. As for them, the Saudis are still, the loyal servants of U.S. imperialism. When it comes down to it, they have their rows with them. They play hardball a bit more now than they used to, which is why they've been involved in they've sort of danced towards BRICS and danced away from it again. Why they work with the Russians on OPEC Plus, but fundamentally, it's the U.S. which is the biggest player in Saudi Arabia and will remain so. And Paul Smith is right. All the US can do is create failed states. Again, they would have preferred stable puppet regimes in Libya and Iraq, and they prefer one in Syria. They're not capable of building them, though, because the forces that they deploy to do the fighting for them are too rotten and corrupt and divided amongst themselves to actually build anything. That's what happens. So they all end up fighting each other, and you end up with various different factions ruling over various different bits of the country. Like Libya is a country in name only, and a country with a slave market, of course. Sevri Dost says the working class in the West is more detached from anti-imperialism than any other, operating almost entirely as a labor aristocracy. I'll continue your comment. Western leftism not only infects their own working class, but also extends its reach into other countries where workers face far worse conditions. On the latter point, I agree with you. Western leftism is a fucking poison, and if you find it in your country, kick it out rapidly. But with regard to the working class, the labor aristocracy dominates working class politics, has done for a long time. That's true, which is why communists must go, to use Lenin's term, lower and deeper into the masses. Those who are not dominated by the labor aristocracy, those who are outside of it and outside of its influence, those who have already reached a correct conclusion that the system is working against them, even if they don't know exactly why. Competing for influence within the labor aristocracy and the trade union bureaucracy is one of the reasons why most Marxist organizations are a joke, because they all basically amine themselves to the ideology of the labor aristocracy, which is corrupt social democracy. Alexander Meta Pistrito says Syrians were impoverished by sanctions, and the conflict was about moving to Lebanon, weapons moving to Lebanon and Palestine. Well, it's gone on a lot longer than that. It's been going on for since 2011. I mean, it's about the same plan that the US has been operating off since the early 90s. I mean, this is where that famed list of Wesley Clark was talking about came from. It's basically a list of countries where they were still not completely on board with the US-led order, and the US needed to have total dominance over them. So Yugoslavia, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen. I mean, though their 10-year war on Yemen failed, but they're probably going to have another go now. I also learned from a reliable source, Al Danmarki on Twitter, who is a guy who runs a Danish fellow who runs a Twitter account, very good coverage of the Ansar Allah movement and the Yemeni struggle. He revealed that the Assad-led government turned the Yemeni embassy over to the Saudi puppet regime, the Yemeni puppet regime run by the Saudis, and kicked the Ansar Allah movement out of there. So shows that there's the advance of Saudi influence inside the Damascus government has been going on a long time. This was several years ago this happened. So clearly the rot has been growing for quite some time. Well, to answer Droney Donny's point, look, you can mourn the passing of this struggle, but our job is to analyze the failure. And yeah, it was part of my journey towards a greater level of understanding as well. And now we must take that understanding and we must use it to analyze further this defeat and to inform our own political practices. Again, our job, if we are in the West, is to build our forces. That is the only way forward. Again, there's no outsourcing this. There's no hoping that somebody else will do it for us. And this is one of the many reasons why I absolutely categorically refuse to, as some do, just write off the working classes of the West as either hopelessly bought off or hopelessly stupid. Again, that's an anti-Marxist position, not backed up by actual reality, the class contradictions that exist in Britain in reality or in the US. Well, Nihilo Nostrum, everyone kicks down on Western leftism because it's an absolute crap and is a pro-imperialist Trotskyite failure that has only led us down dead ends. That's why it is critiqued, and that's why increasing numbers of people are rejecting it. Alan says, what happened to the Syrian army? Well, if you go back to the beginning of the stream, I outline as to why. It's just simply its own commanders sabotaged it. And again, its own commanders seem to have been bought off principally by the Gulf states. Edward says, why is the Kurdish state a red line for the Turkish bourgeois if it is a servant of the US? Why not just dismember Turkey like the USSR and fuck off to Miami? Well, the Turkish bourgeois operates in a strange situation. On the one level, they're very loyal servants of the US imperialists, but there are again contradictions within that. They are afraid. I think you can argue about whether it's justified or not, but they are afraid that if a Kurdish state emerges in Syria, then it'll aid the Kurdish struggle inside Turkey itself. Also, be aware that the Turkish state itself is a lot more fragile than it appears. I mean, it's ruled over by this very corrupt criminal enterprise run by Erdogan. Its opposite, the so-called opposition, might be even worse. They're even more pro-US. The aim of the Turkish bourgeois and Erdogan is to try and position themselves to have a foot in both camps, to profit off the BRICS system and to also have their faces turned towards Europe. And there's still some in the Turkish bourgeois that want to join the EU. Good luck with that when the EU eventually falls to pieces, as it will at some point in the next decade. I'm sure of it. So yes, the Turkish bourgeois are in a very contradictory position. The US doesn't particularly like Erdogan, but again, they own the Turkish security system and have done for an awful long time. So they will always be loyal servants when the US cracks the whip. As to be the red line nature of the Kurdish question, I mean, it's a big thing in Turkish politics that all of the different factions that have composed various different Turkish governments over the last 70 years have been aligned around, which is their absolute refusal to countenance any concession or hint of concession to the Kurdish population. And again, if there's some kind of Kurdish statelet continues to exist in northern Syria, the Turkish state will go all out to destroy it. Again, it's a very paranoid, very twitchy group that runs the Turkish state with good justification from their point of view. Slave market's a product of NATO. That's true. Right, just scrolling down here. The Qataris also poured a lot of money into Syria, says Risto Kostadinov. And in 2011, they funded the war too. Yeah, I mean, Gulf state influence in Syria was building in the decades before the war, in the 90s and the 2000s. Like the Saudis and the Gulf states were, especially the Gulf states, were putting a lot of money into Syria, as Risto Kostadinov says in his comment there. And so they were building influence there. They were clearly building networks there. Quite what the Syrian government was doing, allowing them to pump so much money in, I'm not sure. It might have been because the Syrian government lacked allies and was willing to take investment from anywhere, but the investment from the Gulf states came with a very big price tag attached to it. Just going through. Yes, the US has been incredibly open about its plans to overextend Russia. So the Russian ruling group can't say that they weren't warned. Again, this Rand Corporation report is being kicked around. This was something that, again, like this has been open. Like the US's plans for Russia have been open since 1992. But there are none as blind as those who will not see. And there are those within Russia who chose to not see where that was going. Jay Londonono says, is this connected to a negotiated US-Russia settlements in the Ukraine conflict? Was there a deal here cut, and of what nature? I don't think so. I don't think so for the following reasons. The Russians are, what the Russians have said about the former Syrian government consistently basically moving away from them and moving more into the orbit of the Gulf states, that is true. That is undoubtedly true. And that this was the influence which caused the Syrian army to atrophy and then collapse, or to be collapsed by its own leaders. That's also true. So whereas it's tempting to pin all the blame on the Russians and the Iranians, I think the Russian role here has always been as much as the Syrian government wanted it to be. And I think that's true. The Russians have always said that, and I think they are telling the truth about that they did as much as the Syrian government asked them to. Now, there's a lot of talk coming out of like Tehran about how the Assad government refused to open a front against the Israelis on the Golan. I'm skeptical about whether that was ever a possibility or whether the Iranians even asked for that. But again, I will wait for more information before deciding about that. But certainly the biggest factor here, to my mind, is the influence of the Saudis and the Gulf states within the Syrian government. And it seemed to me that that influence did cause the role of the Russians to be downgraded. It certainly seemed to cause the shift in the way the army was managed after 2018. And I can see the decision-making process there, which is the Gulf states have got a lot of money. They were probably offering all kinds of things. They were probably offering all kinds of investments and inducements, saying, "Oh, we'll give you X, Y, and Z. We'll have a word with the Americans and get sanctions relief. We can get things normalized." And all of that would have been enough to bring enough of the senior Syrian state officials into their orbit of influence. Now, as to Assad himself, we don't know. And again, as I said, nobody rules alone. Everybody rules as part of a network, a group. And if they brought enough of the people around Assad into concurrence with them, again, Assad might have been promoted, presented with a fait accompli and wasn't able to do anything. Until he speaks, if he speaks, we don't know. Apparently, a lot of the people who worked with the Russians are now Syrians who work with Russians. Some of them are going to Russia. That's another thing that Russian sources have said. Right. So we got a comment from, is it Zad Iti, who says, I was talking to a pro-Assad Syrian a few weeks ago, thinking the Syrian front was okay, from Greater Syria to vanishing Syria. Yeah. There seems to be a lot of complacency there. I, 'cause, I, 'cause, 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 Fiskil says Chinese need to keep an eye on Qatari bankers. Yeah, exactly. Look, the Gulf states are untrustworthy tools of imperialism. Look, the PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, said correctly analyzed that as late as like the 1968 in their original political strategy. The Gulf states have always been as crucial for the influence, the keeping of Anglo-American influence in the region, or the extension of it. They're as crucial, but in different ways, as the Israelis are. Like the Gulf states and the Zionists have been working together for as long as both have existed, and they should be seen really as the two wings of imperialist influence within West Asia, or two of the most crucial components of it. The other part being, of course, the imperialist relationship with the Turkish state. But they're as pernicious and rotten an influence as the Israeli regime is, and they're as important to imperialism as the Israeli regime. Okay. Judith asks, how much of a blow is this to the resistance forces? Serious. It's a serious blow because it revealed a lot of limitations. And I mean, Hezbollah won't just have one supply route, of course. They'll have numerous, but it is a blow. Again, to return to what I've said before, the biggest weakness of Hezbollah is the fact that they are a force that exists within a very weak state that's been ruled over by compradors. The fact that Hezbollah have achieved anything at all is remarkable. But again, until a national liberation process is completed, until a national liberation struggle is won inside Lebanon itself, then any action which any group, including Hezbollah, takes against Israel is going to be limited by the very weakness of the Lebanese state itself. And it reveals that these struggles against imperialism are not best waged by any bourgeois. Even like national bourgeois factions will always look to duck out and always look to compromise with imperialism. It's only the proletariat and the peasantry, if properly organized, can actually fight imperialism to the finish, because their interests aren't bound up with it anything like as much as the various bourgeois factions. This was revealed in like the Chinese liberation struggle over and over again. The bourgeois in China were far more afraid of the Chinese masses than they ever were of the Japanese militarists, which is why they ended up compromising with the Japanese so many times. It's only the proletariat and peasantry in any country can lead a struggle for national liberation. And the other classes can come along as part of that struggle, but the leadership has to be, depending upon the class composition of a country, either proletariat and peasantry in alliance with each other. Look at what the various bourgeois factions achieve in their struggles: compromise, capitulation, and disaster. Yeah, Rista Costadino says, by the time Saddam woke up in terms of the Gulf states, it was already 1990 and we saw what happened. Yeah, Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi Baathists made themselves into tools of imperialism. They sought to assume the role of like regional policemen for the US imperialists. I was reading the Communist Party of Great Britain Marxist-Leninist book, a compilation of journalism done by Harpal Brar and Ella Rule on the Iran-Iraq war. I forgot that the Iraqi government back then actually sank a US naval vessel when they were allied with each other, to try and force the US to assist them more in the war against Iran. I'd forgotten about it. I didn't even know that. But the Iraqis started a war at the behest of imperialism. Imperialism played them like a fiddle. Got the Iraqi state was pushed to near bankruptcy, and the imperialists got the Saudis and the Gulf states to underwrite it. But then it sort of indebted and beggared the Iraqi government. And then when it lost, it was losing money hand over fist due to Kuwaiti slant drilling into one of their oil fields. That produced ultimately the conditions which led to the invasion. Again, a series of disastrous mistakes, including taking money off the Gulf states. They are not your friends, ever. Right, okay. Now, 894 of you watching so far. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in. Thanks also to our moderator, Jenny, who is in the chat. I'm just going to scroll back up to see if there's any more questions. If I missed any... if I missed any questions, then do email me at the usual address, because if I miss a question that you want me to address, I'm happy to pick it up on a future stream. Right. So I'm going to bring things to a close for today. Thanks to everybody who's watched. There's a great deal of you on there. I hope I've answered some of your questions. This is an ongoing story that, of course, we will be revisiting. But I'll simply conclude by saying that one should not fall easily into the merciless arms of despair. The job is to analyze and to understand, and to take that understanding into the working class. That's our role as communists, and that's what we must do. Despair is for people who are addicted to YouTube algorithms, and unfortunately, we are not. So thank you to everybody who has tuned in, and over 900 of you now. Be sure to like and share this stream if you have not done so already, and I will be back with you again tomorrow. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. And I'll be doing some more audio uploads onto Patreon. There'll be more Patreon exclusive content coming in the week as well. See you all tomorrow, everybody. Good night and solidarity.